Up to you.
Yeah, let's go ahead and start since we're at 6:03. It is with great pleasure and honor to welcome today Dr. Shadee Malaklou, Assistant Professor and Chair of the Women's and Gender Studies Department at Berea College and the founding director of the Women's and Gender Non-Conforming Center. Dr. Malaklou's research focuses on critical race, gender, and sexuality studies with an expertise in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, published in 1952. Dr. Malaklou's research interrogates the metaphysical relationship between space and time to argue that gender and sexuality are produced as human identities and types through the presumed timelessness that Enlightenment modernity assigns to Black people. This research contributes significantly to not just the study of racial Blackness, but also how we understand non-Black differences. Prior to joining Berea, Malaklou was an assistant professor and acting chair of critical identity studies at Berea College, where she was also a Mellon faculty fellow for the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. In addition to her appointment at Berea, Malaklou currently serves as visiting faculty in the Center for Expanded Poetics at Concordia University in Montreal. She received her PhD in culture and theory and graduate certificates in critical theory and gender and sexuality studies from the University of California, Irvine, and her BA in cultural anthropology and women's studies from Duke University. Dr. Malaklou will be presenting tonight on Chronopolitical Assemblages, How Gender Reassignment Makes Racial Genus in Modern Iran. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that warm introduction. I thought I might start with some reflection about who I was at Duke, the conditions of possibility that brought me to Duke, who I've become since Duke, and why the research that I share with you today is as personal as it is political. When I arrived at Duke in 2003, I was eager to create a way out of the racial historical schemas that were assigned to me in the white suburbs that bred and hailed but could not know me. These schemas were personified in the figure of my maternal Iranian grandmother, or Mamanjun. I remember the shame of taking my Mamanjun's hand each morning on the way to school as classmates stared at her chador and whispered. And I remember the white gaze of their parents, which wrote her and me as her kin into being not as an agent with the power to affect history with a capital H, but as its artifact, making me a problem I intuited even then as a problem for time. I was just beginning to understand the ways in which their social and political constructions of time hailed me and hail me still, when one day in kindergarten, my 5-year-old neighbor, a nice enough white girl named Megan, gave me an ultimatum. She would thereafter extend her friendship to me on the condition that I stop speaking Persian and that I dissociate from my grandmother. Her racism, shrouded in friendship, was amplified by taunts from peers who called me, quote, it and monkey on the playgrounds of my becoming. Desperate for a little whiteness in my life, I diligently worked to effect those changes that I could. I found that much of the white mimicry that was demanded of me, for example, Megan instructed me to dye my hair blonde so that I could be, quote, beautiful, required curating cisgender expression, and that if I could signpost myself as categorically woman, then I could also signpost whiteness, accessing the being and time that was otherwise foreclosed to me. While I did not yet have the language for it, I learned at that time that gender difference is made possible by structural racism, which is none other than planetary speciesism. As the darkest, hairiest kid in a white neighborhood, the nouns it and monkey hailed me, so much so that I did not recognize myself the first time a classmate used she, her pronouns, in other words, human pronouns to describe me. Theirs were not exceptional taunts, but rather matters of fact, expressed also or especially by other children of color who were desperate to pass the buck of their ontological anxieties onto a more plausible other. It was our presumed location in a time before human time that likewise rendered us it and monkey, but it was I, as the darkest and hairiest among them, who would bear the face of that inhumanism. It wasn't until the 4th grade, when a Black family moved into the neighborhood, that I and other non-Black children of color would no longer feel ourselves as beasts of burden. Years later, thinking that I could make my own meanings, and impatient for Duke to know me in gendered and thus human terms, I danced on tables, at parties, and I wrote about it. And I told other Duke women, 10 years before Belle Knox would do the same, that this is what liberation looked like. Forgetting Audre Lorde's lesson that, quote, some problems we share as women, but, quote, some we do not. I sought a language then, and I do now, for what I already knew to be true, that for me and other people of color, race and racism produce gender and sexuality. As an undergraduate, I spoke loudly in the Chronicle and on the Quad about what I thought was sexual liberation, which I associated with the liberal humanism of Enlightenment Europe, specifically with its promise of what Walter Benjamin describes as, quote, the time of the now. It is the time of the now, Enlightenment lore tells us, which yields the, quote, modern gender typology of humanism, also with a capital H. I could not access this gendered and thus human recognition on the manicured playgrounds of my youth, and nor could I access them I was to learn at Duke. But I tried anyway. I hypersexualized myself at Duke because the white gaze of peers, professors, administrators, and white staff as a panopticon that spanned the many quads on campus ascribed to me a racial historical schema that precluded me from being in the time of the now, which is the time of gender, which is the time of the human. I hypersexualized myself in those moments because I wanted the Stephen Millers and lacrosse players who roamed and owned Duke's campus to know my humanity. More immediately, I hypersexualized myself because I wanted to know and feel my own body, brown, hairy, porous, disgusting, as human. My overeager performance of what I thought was a, quote, progressive sexuality was born from the knowledge that my humanity was only contingently recognized when I signposted myself as a woman, specifically as a, quote, modern woman with cis hetero appeal. This drag worked, I think, because the Black women on campus and locally, like Crystal Mangum, who were unbossed and unbought and ungendered, could hold the weight of my ontological anxieties. Which is to say, I was able to know myself as a woman, indeed as categorically human, albeit with some pageantry and performance, precisely because this was foreclosed to them. What I was seeking as a child and then at Duke, and what I seek still, is a language that will explain why, for me and other people of color, race and racism produce gender and sexuality. I found this language when I read Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon taught me that my human recognition, contingent on gender performance, is determined by social and political constructions of time, or by a chronopolitics that locates people of color, and especially Black people, in the time of the bush, in the time before human civilization, when gender was not differentiated or scripted, and ars erotica made for unchecked and unbridled sexualities. This was not the time of man's overrepresentation. That would come later, in the post-Enlightenment time of the now, ruled by what Fanon scholar Sylvia Wynter describes as the, quote, genre of man. If racism is speciesism, is gender, then it is the species of man's racism, Wynter teaches us, that creates the whole of this world's, quote, isms, including its cis heteropatriarchy. My research draws on Wynter and others to argue that what we associate today with modern gender and sexual expression is determined by Euro-Enlightenment social and political constructions of time, and that this chronopolitics marches to the unilinear and teleological time of white civilizational progress. Insofar as race, as a cipher for one species, human or otherwise, is bounded by this march of progress, it supersedes and structures all appeals to gender and sexual differentiation. I argue that this chronopolitical ordering system is planetary, operating even or especially in locations where Euro-Western modernity is said not to go, like Iran, where talking heads and laypersons alike claim to do away with Europe's man, seeking instead, as Jalal Allah Ahmad and Ali Shariati clamored for at the height of Iran's civil unrest in the 1970s, an alternative modernity, by which I mean an alternative timeline that does not march to the myth of Euro-America's positivism and progress. But in today's Iran, the white gaze still rules, goading Iranians to reach for the carrot, for the gender recognition that will deliver them to the time of the now, or to the apex of the white human, distinguishing them as racially modern subjects of history, again with a capital H. I draw on the Iranian example because insofar as the Islamist state feigns ideological disparity with the West, and insofar as Iranians are caught up in, quote, practical Occidentalisms, by which they discipline their dense and unruly bodies of color to become or appear white, contemporary Iran is a telling example of how man's chronopolitical worlding operates. What I share with you today is but one snapshot of that disciplinary apparatus. Wearing, quote, white masks, in other words, hallucinating the whiteness that they do not have, Iranians today use a racial calculus to measure their sex and gendered modernities, taking care to curate and narrate these modernities in popular media produced for the West in ways that testify to their humanity. Knowing that the modern episteme spatializes sexual differences as racial tropes, authorizing white viewers to do the looking that locates them in or absence them from the time of the now, Iranians hope to beat Europe at its own game by quite literally making cisgenders, not as markers of Allah Ahmad's and Shariati's alternative modernity, but as the receipts for Iranians' Euro-Enlightenment humanity. In today's talk, I unpack the Islamic State's support for gender reassignment to suggest that gender in Iran is a code word for race, is a code word for genus, or in Persian, jins. My research finds that the Islamic Republic's uncanny support for gender reassignment, recall that the state criminalizes homosexuality, uses Enlightenment Europe's racial calculus to measure for themselves and signpost for a white gaze Iranians' sex and gendered modernity. Support for sex change is a way for the nation's talking heads and laypersons alike to evidence to their empirical overlords and cohorts that Iran's legal and medical institutions are modern, or at the very least are modernizing, according to a Euro-American timeline, and that Iranians are, as they have claimed all along, for example, in defense of Iran's nuclear program, innovators who must be allowed, following Allah Ahmad's recommendation, to pave their own path forward, or as the case may be, to pave a path otherwise. The problem I find is when this otherwise is confused with the forward movement of man's chronopolitics. That is to say, the problem is when Iranians seek to enter the location where Europe and America have been all along and which cannot in fact accommodate them. Gender reassignment in Iran then aims not to make trans persons, but to forge a new Iranian genus or kind or type, one that can climb man's ladder of progress, even or especially as Iranians claim to want to pursue alternative timelines. Which is to say, state-sanctioned gender reassignment in Iran responds to the same ontological anxieties that I experienced on Duke's campus and on the playground. These are the same anxieties I experience still. These are the anxieties of sex change in Iran. Iran's discourse of sex change, which posits trans subjectivity as God's will, is in search of a genesis story, a genus or jins that does not topple the teleological order of Euro-American modernity as Allah Ahmad's revolution endeavored. Rather, this discourse seeks out an origin story that might testify to Iran's hierarchical racial belonging. That is to say, it's white, or as Iranians maintain, Indo-European belonging in the civilizational order that I describe as a chronopolitics. It does so to oppose the violences of Euro-American empire, even as it reproduces them. Sex change in today's Iran responds to the nation's feminization as empire's other. It testifies to that other, the Iranian nation, undertaking a phallic project that might finally signpost its people as proper subject of human history at a genital level, also translated to jins in Persian. I want to pause here to impress that both racial genus or humankind and genital type translate to jins in Persian. If, as Winter suggests, it is the genre or jins of the Iranian person that makes her isms, then the categorical attention of Shiite scholars to sex as genitalia means that the Iran of the Islamic Republic correlates sex change with Euro-American race science, which endeavors to make not just any gender, but a polished and perfected cisgender that can signpost white humanism. Insofar as trans subjectivity is characterized by departure and not by arrival, what Susan Stryker describes as the quote, movement away from an unchosen starting place. Sex change in Iran makes not trans persons, but a new unmarked Iranian, one that in being trans is actually cis, and in being cis can climb man's ladder of time, which is his ladder of racial modernity, which is his gender hierarchy. The post-op Iranian's new jins supposedly makes her eligible for the polished and perfected, but notably not universal humanism that Enlightenment Europe promised to Iran and to its other, quote, laboratories of modernity, but never delivered. It is the promise and lie of this universality that goads even those Iranians who cry for, quote, death to America to support gender reassignment technologies, which is to say it is not their savagery, but their white mimicry and reach for modernity that prompts Iranians to reproduce the same racism and cis heteropatriarchy that locates Iran, even in progressive articulations, as not there yet, never there yet, always already denied co-evilness with Europeans and Americans. My research intervenes in Iranians' curations and narrations of sex change in two documentaries, which are really confessionals, distributed by HBO. These are the 2008 documentary Be Like Others, directed by Tanaz Eshaghian, and season 3, episode 5 of the new series Vice, which aired in 2015. I find that Iranians participate in this English language media, which is a media produced for the white gaze, because they seek recognition from the gatekeepers of empire, not for their non-normative genders and sexualities, but for their modern gender difference or racial genus or jins. In other words, for their humanity. This media exploits what Western audiences intuit as a contradiction, that the Islamic Republic of Iran criminalizes homosexualities, but financially supports gender reassignment, providing grants to patients undergoing reassignment and further institutionalizing trans care and rights. While it bears noting that talking heads and lay Iranians alike associate homophobia with the rejection of the West, specifically with the rejection of the West-struck dandy that Allah Ahmad warns against, this homophobia primarily responds to the ontological anxiety whereby Iranians fear lapsing back in the eyes of their colonial beholders into the time of the Bush, or at least into the Qajar time of Amrad love, which Imperial Europe pathologized as a sign of Iranians' backwardness. The Islamic Republic's homophobia corroborates the orthodoxy that American audiences expect from a people stuck in time, but the state's support for gender reassignment does not. The Islamic State today carries out more gender reassignment surgeries than any country in the world besides Thailand, more than 300 each year, and Iranian sex change surgeons are often Western trained. These numbers, which are especially staggering for male to female transitioning patients, suggest that gender reassignment in Iran regulates the genitalia of natural-born men to non-therapeutic ends. More specifically, that it regulates their genitalia towards corrective ends. Iranian men with same-sex sexualities who are narrativized in medical and legal discourses as the proprietors of an inert and unviable and impotent jins are especially pressured by families, communities, and government institutions, including those responsible for healthcare and education, to pursue gender reassignment as reparative therapy for their adult same-sex sexualities. Vice correspondent Thomas Morton's informants, for example, corroborate that while their countrymen are forgiving of female same-sex sexualities, The culture, and not just the religion, detest male same-sex sexualities, which Iran and Iranians abstract as a desire to be anally penetrated as the object of another man's desire, or as kuni. Male to female women are frequently disowned by their families and made to live on the streets, sometimes as prostitutes. But female to male men who have never been anally penetrated can transition with trepid family and community support, affecting, quote, normal lives. I suspect because their preoperative sexualities do not invoke them as sodomites, which is to say, female same-sex sexualities are not suggestive of the racial degeneracy ascribed to Iran by modern historiography, and thus do not betray Iran's self-image as an Indo-European nation. Having never been made into an object, a passive receptacle that receives but cannot enact human desire, trans men are not available as unsignified flesh that sex change can remake into a new whole. Sex change as therapy or cure for homosexualities activates what Kalpana Shastari Cooks describes as the fantasy or promise of being wholly white or wholly human, wholly male or wholly female, but mostly wholly male. The language of rebirth typical of male to female transitions is absent in cases of female to male transitions because, as I will explain, trans men need not be cut in the same way. So, it would seem that while, quote, a key component of achieving modernity and becoming civilized in the Iranian present is, quote, the eradication of supposedly unnatural love among men, and requires the repudiation of Iranians as penetrated objects or kunis, non-penetrative female same-sex sexualities are inconsequential to the project of Iranian modernity. Unlike male same-sex sexualities, which amplify colonial caricatures of national impotence as the measure of national virility, male sexualities are a cipher for the health of the nation and measure Iran's civilizational development. The male to female trans women interviewed by Morton and Eshaghian alike anticipate gender reassignment as rebirth, that is to say, as a cut in the fabric of their being. The accounts of their families and partners as well corroborate this narrative, suggesting that male to female reassignment, if not female to male reassignment too, is not experienced as the site of continuity, that is to say, as a site of self-actualization, but instead resolves to contain, negate, and correct a person's, quote, felt sense of gender and sexuality, especially of sexuality. To borrow from leading scholar of sex change in Iran, Afsaneh Najmabadi, quote, setting up a life that wipes out all traces of one's earlier life is the ideal goal of gender reassignment for trans women in Iran. Najmabadi's ethnographic studies suggest that gender reassignment is a technology that makes live in the biopolitical sense by emptying the preoperative body of its person. It is to this effect that Dr. Mohammad Reza Mohammadi, a medical practitioner affiliated with the Office of Islamic Studies and Mental Health, who, Najmabadi reports, prescribes, quote, spiritual therapy for trans patients he suspects of, quote, character disorders, contends that Iranians, quote, can be talked into heteronormativity through, quote, a concept that is broader than death as the end of life. This is one in which, quote, being born is at the same time a death, and in which, quote, dying is similarly a new birth. The preoperative trans body marked for reassignment is a vessel that can be evacuated of its person, an amalgamation of flesh that can be cut and differentiated anew, making it an ideal canvas for the rewriting of an Iranian genus or jins. This strategy is not incidental. I find that Iranian nationalism has since its inception in the late 19th century, and especially after the onset of constitutional reforms in the early 20th century, sought to inscribe Iran as a racially modern state following the Euro-American model. Biopolitical institutions in the Islamic State continue to deploy Euro-Enlightenment, quote, isms to consolidate knowledge about Iran's body politic, not least of all in the field of, quote, legal medicine, instituted after regime change to make medical science, meaning Iran's community of medical scientists, accountable to Islamic jurisprudence. This field purposefully conflates physiological medicine with literature about psychosexual sexology to mime and mine what Michel Foucault famously describes in his first volume of History as the emergence of sexuality as an object of knowledge. I'm specifically interested in how religiously devout and socially conservative Iranians, persons publicly opposed to Euro-American modernity and its isms, namely ideologues of the revolution like Ayatollah Khomeini, invoke Europe's scienza sexualis in order to authorize sex change. As a strategy for making Iranians modern, gender reassignment is not, as Islamists claim, the work of God. Rather, it is an essentially West-struck project, endowing man and not God with the power to make live. As even socially conservative and religiously devout Iranians measure sex and gender difference using the same Euro-Enlightenment isms that relegate Iranians to a people stuck in time. Indeed, the task at hand is to understand what incentivizes clerics and other implements of the Islamic State to endorse sex change as a spectacle of medical, that is to say, of human achievement, as well as how news of their support gains traction in popular media outside of Iran, specifically in the United States. Iranians, at least officially cut off from the West, seek out modern scopic regimes. As Najmabadi argues, they intuit that, quote, a key component of achieving modernity and, quote, becoming civilized in the European and American optic is the, quote, eradication of unnatural love among men. The Iranians interviewed in Be Like Others and Vice testify to transness as a sign of the times, of progress, deliverance, and redemption, or of a forward movement that induces civilizational development. I find that theirs is a defensive posture in response to the modern historiography that pathologized Iranian male same-sex sexualities in the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically, which pathologized the love between an older, bearded, penetrative man and a younger, beardless, penetrated adolescent male youth, which was a common practice in Qajar Iran. This, to the overlords of empire, became a sign of racial degeneracy. During this period and against the backdrop of Europe's scienza sexualis, which organized sex and gender according to binary types, Iran experienced a period of sexual fluidity. Young beardless boys or amrads were eroticized in male circles and especially in public spaces like the royal court, monasteries and seminaries, taverns, military camps, gymnasiums, bathhouses, and coffee houses, not as objects of homosexual desire or even pederasty, but as substitutes for the natural-born women with whom adult men were culturally barred from sharing public space. As we see in some of the miniatures to emerge from this period, the Amrad was socialized in female spaces. Because he was imagined as sexually fluid and undeveloped and therefore not yet a man, his presence in female-only spaces did not function as a trespass, as a man's presence would. The Amrad could move freely between male-dominated public sphere, where he was eroticized, and the private sphere of female domesticity. In both, he was feminized, though notably, at least in emic accounts, the adult man, or mukana, or amraduna, who pursued amrad love was not. According to Najmabadi, it wasn't until the 20th century, that is to say at the height of empire's reach in Iran, that Iranians became acutely aware that sexual relations between adult men and a sexually undeveloped or amrad boy were considered vices. More specifically, that amrad love signaled at once a problem of sexual differentiation and a developmental delay, or a problem, I argue, for time. Iranians were quick to recognize that Imperial Europe's chronopolitical order marked amrad love as a sign that they could not move forward literally and metaphorically to arrive in the time of the now. Iranians disciplined their dense, unruly bodies of color to petition for inclusion in sex and gender modernity, and thus for recognition as modern human types. National modernity in the 20th century, as a product of the Pahlavi regime, took up this chronopolitical order in an effort to, as Najmabadi notes, make Iran's modernization project, quote, legible for the already modern, specifically, quote, recognized by the Europeans, by disavowing homoerotic desire between the amrad, or young male adolescent object of desire, and the adult man, further pathologizing that adult man too as a particularly feminine and therefore impotent figure who has nothing to contribute to a nation of people who are beginning to take their seat at the table of Euro-American modernity. Made analogous to the homosexual, this adult man was imagined, according to Najmabadi, as one who, quote, makes himself look like a young beardless man, displaying a wish to remain the object of desire of adult men, end quote. In other words, the adult man in pursuit of amrad love became, at the height of Iran's modernization project, analogous to the amrad in the traditional Iranian context and to the homosexual in the Euro-American context. Today, homosexualities between Iranian men signal a return to the adult man as a mukana or amraduna. That is to say, same-sex desires between adult men signal a developmental delay. Adult men with amrad attractions become in the 20th century and are still today symptomatic of a nation stuck in time, unable to develop or progress. These men are narrativized by Iranian countrymen in ways that are similar to how the nation was characterized at the height of empire as the West and hence as Iran's other. It is for this reason that male homosexual acts today are punishable by death, but women suspected of, quote, placing female genitalia on the genitalia of the same sex, end quote, are sentenced to a punitive, in other words, non-lethal 100 lashes. Like women suspected of same-sex sexualities, men convicted of tafkeeds or non-penetrative sex acts are also sentenced to 100 lashes. One might deduce that the Islamic Republic sentences all persons suspected of sodomy, but not all persons suspected of homosexual activities to immediate death, because sodomy signals racial degeneracy in the Orientalist lore that informed Euro-American historiographic accounts of Iran, and which continues to caricature the Iran of today as a nation of impotent kunis. As just one example, I offer this caricature of a nuclear missile sodomizing the effigy of former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, made by the pro-Israeli lobby group Iran 180 for its 2011 San Francisco Pride Parade float. Like their modern counterparts, that is to say, not unlike the secular Pahlavi approach of the 20th century, conservative and devout Iranians today liken adult men with same-sex desires to the amrad or beardless adolescent male youth. They infer, following the amrad model, that these men simulate vaginal intercourse and sex acts with other men as a substitute for the real thing. More to the point, they assume, or rather hope, that same-sex desires are a transitional phenomena and that adult men with same-sex sexualities will soon pass from, quote, an object of desire to, quote, the desiring man. Given prejudices against the formal criminalization of adult amrad or same-sex love, it bears pausing here to ask how sex change became normalized. Ayatollah Khomeini, the nation's first supreme leader, notably wrote about sex change before he swept into power in 1979. In a 1967 and 1968 ruling he composed while in exile in Iraq, Khomeini devotes an entire subsection to, quote, the changing of sex, wherein he writes, quote, the prima facie or al-Zahir view is contrary to prohibiting the changing by operation of a man's sex to that of a woman's sex, or vice versa. Likewise, the operation is not prohibited in order that he or she may become incorporated into one of the two sexes, end quote. In response, at least two hospitals, one in Tehran and the other in Shiraz, accommodated gender reassignment by the mid-1970s. While Iran's first reassignment surgery took place in 1973, the practice for intersex patients as a kind of, quote, wondrous spectacle was reportedly underway in Iran since the 1930s. National Body reports that by the 1950s, transsexual surgeries emerged as a variant of the larger scientific marvel of sex change, indeed, as a testament to Iran's scientific progress. Sex change as trans reassignment was halted in 1976 after approximately 30 surgeries. This was when the Medical Council of Iran banned the practice for ethical reasons, except for in cases of intersex patients. The practice was not reconstituted until after 1985, when Khomeini issued a second fatwa, this time as the country's first supreme ruler. The 1985 fatwa, prompted by the trans lobbying efforts of Mariam Hutan Mulkara, a devout male to female trans person who sought Khomeini's counsel, erected the state's current medical and legal gender reassignment infrastructure. In Khomeini's second statement, sex change is again, quote, not prohibited. But because gender reassignment for trans persons was not supported by the Medical Council of Iran in the years immediately following this fatwa, medical professionals, quote, had to turn to their Islamist-identified colleagues to introduce sex change to their fields. Modifications to the body like those induced by sex change, quote, were no longer seen as necessarily intervening in God's design, but rather as aiding or finishing it. According to the legal Shiite scholar, and I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Hujjat al-Islam Kariminiya, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on this subject and is the leading religio-legal authority on gender reassignment in Iran, while there is, quote, nothing wrong in the Quran condemning transsexuality as a sin, same-sex desires and practices, quote, have been forbidden and are recognized as a tremendous sin. In his interview with Vice, Kariminiya specifically cites, quote, the Quranic story of Lut and the passages therein that reproach men of that tribe for, quote, approaching men instead of women lustfully, and for, quote, leaving the wives that their Lord created for them behind. This authoritative interpretation, it bears noting that Kariminiya is tasked with using his doctoral research to, quote, come up with answers to trans questions on the issues of marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, etc. So this authoritative interpretation that he offers renders male same-sex desires and practices as especially suspect. At a transsexual support conference in Gorgan hosted by Iran's Office of Health Ministry and Medical Education, captured on camera by Eshaghian and her team, Kariminiya explains, quote, families repeatedly ask me, and those who want to have a sex change ask, is what we're doing in accordance with Islamic law? If changing your gender was to be considered a sin because you are changing God's natural order, then all of our daily tasks would be sins. You take wheat and turn it into flour and then turn that into bread. That's a change. There are thousands of things we do every day that are changes in God's natural order. Why is that not considered a sin? It bears noting that Kariminiya abstracts sex change as the material construction of a whole from raw materials. In other words, as a polished and perfected whole constructed from unsignified parts or flesh. Dr. Mir Jalali, a practicing sex change surgeon who fancies himself a pioneer of trans care and rights, but who, like the state's authorities and religious clerics, he distances himself from, describes transsexualities as, quote, a problem nature created, makes a similar observation. He characterizes gender reassignment as a violence that requires nothing less than, quote, being ripped apart. In other words, as that which requires the dismemberment of one's flesh into bits and pieces or raw materials that can be put back together anew, again, in the image or imago of a proper Iranian that is sexually differentiated and in being cisgender can march through time to climb man's racial hierarchy. As Kariminiya explained, genital distinctions play a key role in the sexual differentiation of Iran's medical legal discourse, suggesting a conflation between reassignment as a biopolitical imperative in the intersex instance and sex reassignment as a corrective in the gay or homo instance. Sex reassignment as the culmination of God's will is what's at stake here. In Kariminiya's own words, quote, in Islam, categorical sex is bodily sex determined by the genitals. The medical sciences have other grounds as well, such as chromosomes, that may be helpful in disambiguating the intersex. But for the purposes of religious law, it is the apparent sex of the body that counts. Regardless that some Shiite scholars have expressed doubts about the permissibility of gender reassignment for trans persons, most, if not all, legal Shiite scholars, quote, consider intersex surgeries permissible because, and this is important, because they bring out the, quote, hidden genus of the body. In other words, because sex change presumably clarifies the intersex persons and therefore the gay and trans persons unspecified, or in Persian, bila taklif jins, or genus. Stated another way, they support sex change because it clarifies that something intangible that testifies to a person's kind or type, not to their sex, but to their race. The goal here is to sexually differentiate the body in order to specify one's gens, which I have suggested in a nod to Sylvia Wynter, is none other than one's racial designation or genre. The categorical attention of Shiite scholars to sex as genitalia, that is to say, to sex as the differentiation of the physiognomical body, suggests that the Iran of the Islamic Republic correlates sex change with a kind of race science that makes not just any racial type, but which makes polished and perfected a well-defined or whole racial type that can index none other than racial whiteness. This is not a historical racial schema, but a corporeal schema. While Najmabadi translates bila taklif persons as those, quote, in a conundrum, I want to suggest that they are better understood as undisciplined and undifferentiated sexualities, and that these undifferentiated sexualities are only problematic insofar as they signpost a racial conundrum. Among taklif's various meanings are assignment, homework, duty, and notably puberty. Yes, puberty. Its prefix bilal means without. In Najmabadi's summation, but not mine, the, quote, doubling of jins, in which I suggest sexual differences are known as racial ones, quote, provides a distinct set of affiliations for sex in Persian that is not identical, Najmabadi writes, to English and its chains of associations. I disagree with Najmabadi and suspect that in Iran, like in the United States and Europe, which is to say structurally, as the grammar of human taxonomy and symptom of its chronopolitical ordering mechanisms, jins is never just sex, nor can genus or race be innocent of sex. Reassignment cuts the fabric, the racial fabric of a flesh unsignified by puberty or by taklif. And here, Iran's history of Amrad love is important. The sex-gender distinctions Kariminiya abstracts as genital distinctions are actually developmental distinctions. Iranians narrativize sexuality as a developmental story in which same-sex sexualities and desires anticipate and are signified as a transitional phase or adolescent dalliance before arrival into adult heterosexuality. specifically marriage, which according to Najmabadi is, quote, a life cycle social expectation, without which one does not become an adult in others and possibly in one's own perception. The crux of my argument is that reassignment surgery makes modern sex cum gender out of an undifferentiated or racialized flesh to efface the primitivizing specter of sodomy. In Iran, the word jins, which is used to differentiate males from females in a sex gender binary not unlike our own, is actually reproduces Enlightenment modernity's human making project, because it inscribes gender and sexuality with racial significance. The deployment of jins, or as sex or genus, or race or genre in formal interpretations of Islamic thought and governance suggests that even Iran's alternative cultural landscape is overdetermined by social and political constructions of time inherited from Hegel's Europe, and that this chronopolitical order of man is paradigmatic, extending even or especially to those places that are ideologically opposed to the West. Even without the added anticipation of white humanist social and political constructions of time, adult Iranians who pursue same-sex activities when a wife, more specifically when vaginal intercourse is or could become otherwise available, are delayed under the mark of the Amrad. To conclude, if, as Winner suggests, gender is a symptom which testifies to the race or genre or jins of man, then it stands to reason that gender reassignment technologies in Iran and perhaps elsewhere too reproduce Enlightenment Europe's race and racist structures, which are its chronopolitics. Regardless of their adherence or opposition to Islamic values, Iranians imagine themselves as a people who are progressively moving through time to arrive at what Homi Bhabha describes as colonial mimicry and which Fanon specifies as white mimicry. Iranians who support sex change do not do so to enact an oppositional or anti-imperial politics, despite these avowed intentions. They do so rather in a bid to position Iran and Iranians where Enlightenment Europe forbids them from entry, at the zenith of man's civilizational hierarchy. Thank you.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much for that intervention. So rich. I'd like to open it up to questions. You can either put a question into the chat, or you can go ahead and, since we're a relatively small group, you can just go ahead and ask it. So I have just a question about, so you said that the polished and whole body is indicative of a European cisgender self, and how I'm just how do you make the jump from the sexuality of the polished body being a racial, I mean, I understand the connection between the gender and the race, but then why the polished body being a European construct or European Enlightenment construct?
Yeah, so Michelle, I want to say Stevens, maybe Stevenson, a performance studies scholar, and I need to go and check the name, but she has a book called Skin Acts. Yeah. And in Skin Acts, she argues that there's a way in which our the pre-Enlightenment body takes in and absorbs and is porous, and is penetrated, right? What is inside can become outside. There's no boundary. This is why people of color, this is why white people recoil at the touch of people of color, right? But that the post-Enlightenment body, the Enlightenment man body, the man with a capital M, overrepresentation of man, genre of man, that body cannot be penetrated, is closed of all its holes. And Lewis Gordon makes this argument as well in a chapter on effeminacy in Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, that to be feminized is to be racialized, is to be invaginated, is to be constantly, is to have your insides become your outsides, is to have no bounded body, is to have no corporeal schema. But rather the post-enlightenment body, the body of man, the corporeal schema of man, is one that projects, is one that has no holes, is sealed from its holes. So that's the performance studies literature that I'm drawing on.
Very, very, very interesting. I'm going to, does anybody have any questions? Everyone's being very shy.
I want to make a point, may I?
Yes, please.
So my larger research thinks about this in relationship to anti-Blackness, because I find that Iranians, like other third world non-Black people, and I should say here that Iranians have Black people too, you know, like there's a entire population of Afro-Iranians within Iran. The problem is they don't get counted as part of the imagined community of a Persian people. And so what I find is that in order to prove themselves as white, or in order to climb that ladder of time that will signal them as modern or modernizing, they have to pass the buck of their racial anxieties, and they do that to Black people. So there are instances, for example, both in the diaspora and in Iran proper, where the anxiety around sexual, unbridled sexuality gets projected onto Black people, that those are the people of the bush. That's what they do. That's not what we do. So that was not a part of today's conversation, but it's certainly informing the direction that my research goes with regards to thinking about how we reproduce the same racism, the same hierarchy that affects us, but that uniquely objectifies Black people in order to kind of climb this ladder that we can't climb at all.
Everyone's so quiet.
Can I add something here?
Please do.
This is my mother, by the way. I should contextualize this.
Hi.
Wonderful.
I don't know if I should
Of course you should.
unmute the video. I'm not very prepared. I'm so sorry. Hi.
Hi, so great to meet you.
So good to meet everyone. I know, I don't think I've discussed this with Shadee before, but I grew up in Iran. I came here when I went to college. So my experience has been, when we were little, this was very normal because we were supposed to be a virgin. So girls were actually having sexual relationship with girls, and guys were having it with guys. And there was a hush hush, and it was a normal thing to do. And nobody at the time was thinking we were homosexual or bisexual. And then later people would get married and continue the life as is. So I don't know how that plays into race and the sexuality that you're studying, Shadee. I was always puzzled how that plays into it and how that is justified as being okay in the culture. And almost everybody was doing it. I mean, it was a very norm thing to do. But then I remember at one time, Shadee was saying that everyone is almost everyone can be bisexual at some time. So maybe it is true. I don't know. So I guess I just can't get that. Sorry. So I thought maybe you can enlighten me of what your
Sure. And I want to say that I asked her not to speak, so.
I'm mute.
Oh, she did. This is great. This is wonderful. It's so good to meet you.
Thank you. Same here.
So I don't know. I mean, I think that sexuality is a response to, the way sexuality seems to me a response to race is about the act of being penetrated or penetrating. And so what you describe, Nahid, is this impression that women are having sex with other women and men are having sex with other men. Well, the abject in that equation is the man being penetrated, right? Is the man receiving anal sex. He is the one that's said to be a problem. The man doing the penetrating is not problematic. And this is, active versus passive sex. This is not unique to Iran. This is quite endemic. But the thing that's interesting is that when we pander for a white gaze, that we have to then define ourselves. We are a certain type. It's not that we enjoy acts, but we are a kind of person, right? It becomes, sex becomes identity. Sexuality becomes identity. And I think that's a function of racial modernity, of needing to differentiate oneself according to that hierarchy.
Or even that sexual experimentation as an adolescent also, kind of is part of your argument that that's kind of the kind of, prehistory to identity that's seen as being okay, and not being part of that bounded like adult sexuality that's modeled on the European Enlightenment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that what my mother describes is in Pahlavi. It's in the Shah's regime. It's before the revolution. And so there's these continuities. So I think that this notion that the Islamic Revolution was this like line in the sand and things were one way before and another way after is a lie. Just the way that we think that there was, a secular moment that came post-Enlightenment and a pre-Enlightenment moment that was organized around, a higher being, that this is also that those lines blur. And so I really think it's important to think about structure and planetary racism that affects us regardless of who's in power, whether it's in Iran or in the United States. I know our elections are coming up. I would argue that, Black lives didn't matter under Obama. Why do we think they're going to matter? Why do we think they're going to matter under Biden?
And another thing that reminds me, you were saying that penetration is what is called sex. I think in a lot of cultures the same way, or all cultures the same way. I remember with Clinton, when he was accused of having sex, he said, I never had sex because he only had oral sex. There was no penetration. So I think you're right in a way that a lot of people, I guess, in culture do or did feel that way in the past.
Everyone's so quiet. No, does anybody have any questions they'd like to pose either in the chat or just directly?
Man, I must have been really boring. I'm sorry, y'all.
It was not boring. I even wonder if the audience members, know this history of Iran.
Yeah, and I don't think, and I was limited for time. I tried to explain, I really wanted to contextualize who I am and why this matters to me, because and that was really important for me. I believe, as I was telling Julie, I believe in radical vulnerability as a practice. And I just hosted an event with Country Queers before signing on to this one, and in which they emphasize that kind of vulnerable storytelling and truth telling is really important for a kind of anti-imperial, anti-racist movement. And so because of that, I wasn't able to give all the details I wanted to about Iran's history. But there was, just to describe the timeline, since we're talking about time, Qajar Iran was followed by Pahlavi Iran, was followed by the Islamic Republic.
Right.
So that's that timeline. And at the height of the Pahlavi regime, in 1935, the Shah sent a letter to the League of Nations requesting to be recognized no longer as Persia, but as Iran, because Iran was a transliteration of Aryan, and they wanted to signal solidarity with Hitler's race war. The Shah called himself the Prince of Aryans. The modernization project was called the White Revolution. So this shit runs deep, right? And so what's interesting to me is then, if this is the ordering mechanism, if this is the paradigm, right? How is it that when we start making room for sex and gender nonconformity, we're using that same model to somehow make sense of it, and therefore we're reproducing a violence that we claim we're trying to move past?
Yeah, a student asks, what are ways white Duke students can support Black students while at Duke so they don't feel the same pressure?
It's a really good question. You know, I think you need to take the advice of your brilliant Black feminist professors, of which you have many at Duke. And I think that one needs to step back. And I think I learned that too late in life. I, again, grew up brown kid, white neighborhood, very, very insecure, still am. And I was always, and Ellen knows this about me, like, you know, I always arrived with an answer. Like, I always wanted to step in the face of injustice and make something right. And I think that's a lot of privilege talking. And I think that we need to learn to step back. And I think that's really important. I would also argue that you can make room for Black people to tell their own stories and demand their own justice without asking them to do that emotional labor, and without extracting that labor, and without, as Bell and Berea says, without eating the other, right? And so, you know, I would warn against making a spectacle of Black pain, whether it's sharing stories on Facebook and Instagram or circulating videos. And I would warn against asking your Black colleagues, peers, to do the emotional labor of teaching you anything. There's plenty of people who can teach you.
I think everybody, there's a consensus that it was an amazing talk, that everybody is meditating on what you had to say. I think that I personally am dumbfounded, and could not come up with an eloquent response. But yes, yeah, we have a one of Patrice Douglas here is one of your
yes, I was actually, when I was talking about the badass Black feminist professors, I was thinking of my dear friend and colleague Patrice, who everyone should take a class with, including me.
Well, thank you so much. As we say, it was a phenomenal talk. Wonderful. Thank you. So generative. Yeah, everybody's just so thankful for a wonderful talk. And thank you all for coming. And thank you so much for this amazing presentation.
Thank you, Ellen. And thank you for the way you supported me when I was at Duke, when I didn't know who to go to for support. And I didn't understand where those locations were for someone who looked like me. And you were that space for me. And your classroom was the space of radical experimentation. And you were the pedagogue that I aspired to be. So I thank you for everything you've done and do for Duke, and for hosting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.